part 3 in Developing the Next Leaders 5-part series. If you're tracking with us, you remember part 1 was on getting your time right. We have so many different things pulling at us to spend our time in different ways or pull our attraction or our attention into a different stratosphere other than focus on getting the things done that we need to get done when we're in our office or when we're out selling or when we're just having conversations with people. And so we give you those strategies in part 1. Part 2 was on there is data that exists that suggests that there is a more effective way to communicate with clients from an outreach perspective to set up the meetings that we want to get. And so often we as salespeople don't use that data. We share that data in point 2 on video 2, and we connect that most importantly to like the artful tools. So you take the art and you take the science, you put it together, and you have a really successful outreach process. That was part 2. Part 3 is on like the opening or discovery part of this conversation. This is so important for us to get right, because when we get it right, then we get ourselves into the discussions where closing and follow through becomes a lot easier. And so there's 3 things to note. First one is mirror questions can be troublesome. And here's what I mean by that. When we start a conversation, many human beings, this isn't just a salesperson problem, many human beings start the meeting out with or start the conversation out with, how are you? The response usually is, I'm doing great, how are you? Or I'm doing fine, how are you? That is called a mirror question. You say this, they say it right back to you. We get no advancement in the conversation whatsoever. The how are you part of that question is fine. In fact, it's really an important one for us to ask. It shows empathy. It shows like our path toward empathy. But we must add to it, in particular in today's world. How are you doing in light of all the recent success you've had? It's been really amazing to see. That's a different question. How are you in light of? How about this one? How are you doing? I've seen so much great work with this charity that you're so passionate about. How has that happened? And how have you been feeling about all of that? That is a question that leads to real depth in conversations. So how are you works, but it's got to be connected to something. Thought 1, don't just offer the mirror questions, put something behind the mirror. Thought 2 is as stress levels rise, as time frames shorten, human beings are more likely to ask closed-ended questions. Beginning of meetings, stress levels are up. We're just getting to see someone. We need to make sure we ask the right question, and we feel the stress. We feel like time frames are tight, and we're more apt to ask that closed-ended question. It's imperative for us to recognize that, take a breath, and ultimately ask the right open-ended question, which is point 3. There are some open-ended questions that are way more effective than others, just as you'd imagine. Why questions? People say, why are you doing this? Those questions can be troublesome because they can be very leading. They can have the listener saying, uh-oh, they're going somewhere with this. How questions, on the other hand, so like all open-ended questions are better than these closed-ended questions. And I'll tell you, I'll just reiterate the why that is in just a second. But these how questions are so effective for us as salespeople. When we start questions out with how, you take the listener out of their tactical brain, which is the back part of the brain, the majority of their brain, and you push them to that prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the creative part of the brain. It's the brain that does where all the relationships live. And so we need to get people thinking in that creative brain or in that relational brain. And how we do that is one simple word. We ask questions to start with how, in particular when they're in-depth and well-researched. Now, all of this sets up with one of the oldest expressions in our industry, in the sales world, and probably even broader than that. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them proportionally. The reason why that is so troublesome for salespeople and for human beings is because we ask so many closed-ended questions. If you ask a closed-ended question that lasts, say, 7 seconds or 10 seconds or 12 seconds to ask, the response can be a half a second to answer, yes or no. And so that leads us to do more of the talking. That leads us to do more of the interrogating. How we change all that, how we improve the art of discovery in today's world is we pay attention to the 3 things we shared. Mirror questions, put some depth behind them. 2, make sure that you recognize like our science or our buildup says like we as humans are more likely to ask closed-ended questions when we feel stress and we feel time frames shortened. Know that, use it to your advantage, ask open-ended questions. And lastly, what type of open-ended questions should you ask? Make sure they start out with that beautiful word, how. And when we do that, we get ourselves in this relational position and get ourselves where we want to in a relationship. Good selling, everyone.